In every Spring Boot application, you have the main application, which is decorated with a Spring Boot application. This is your main application that will be started. You have the application.properties. This is where you put all of the properties of your application, for example, the URL, username, and password for your database. And you have the pom.xml. If you use Maven, you will have pom.xml. This is where you put all of your dependencies. For example, the MySQL connector and other dependencies, third-party libraries, if you're more familiar with this name. I use VS Code for working with different languages, Java as well, and I have installed Spring Boot extension, which gives me a Spring Boot dashboard. You can also use IntelliJ, which has all of these things built in, so you don't need to bother yourself with installing the extensions. Something which is important in Spring Boot applications is that your application should have different layers. The controller's layer is the layer which is responsible to communicate with the user through REST APIs. The models layer is the layer that gives you the model, the data model that you would like to save on your database. Repositories actually are responsible to communicate with the database through creating the SQL queries, and the services are where you put your business logic, or is where your controller uses in order to communicate with the database. Your controller should never directly use a repository. Your controller should use a service. That service should call a repository to communicate with the database. This is for the security in your application. So whenever you want to create a Spring Boot application, you can go to Spring Initializer. So just Google these words. And then here you can choose what kind of Spring Boot starter you want. I choose Java for the language, and for the project, I prefer to use Maven. Or you can use Gradle if you're more familiar with. And then for Spring Boot version, I go with the default one, 3.2.4. And here you can change the name of the project. I go with all the names that it has suggested. And then for the Java version, I go with 17. And then for the dependencies. So this is a to-do list application. What we need is Spring Web, Spring Data JPA in order to communicate with our MySQL. And later we would like also to add a Spring Security, but for now we go with only these two dependencies. After choosing everything, you click on Generate. It asks you where would you like to download it. I put it in my downloads. So after you've downloaded the zip file, you can just unzip it here. I open a terminal from here. And in this terminal, I go with VS Code. You can use whatever IDE or text editor you prefer. In your application, you see that you have a source folder, main folder, Java folder, and this is your main application. So first of all, let's see if we can really start our application. The demo application contains a main method, and for us, this is the main class that we would like to start. And okay, it failed because there is no database that it needs to get connected to. In my local machine, I have MySQL running, so I just put the properties that is needed, so the data source URL, username, and password. And this is the syntax that you can use in the application.properties. It says if there is an environment variable of MySQL host, use that for the URL. Otherwise, go for localhost. If there's an environment variable for the port, use that. Otherwise, go for 3306. And if there is a username and password, use that. Otherwise, go for root and someone 1234. So you can choose whatever you like. Usually in the production, you have different application.properties with different active profiles. I will also teach you that in the future. So usually you don't see something like this in production. Each profile has its dedicated database, username, and password. So one of the dependencies that I have forgotten to inject while I was creating my Spring Boot application was this dependency, MySQL connector J. This is the reason my application is not getting started. Create 3 folders: controllers, models, repositories, services. And inside each of them, we will put the code that we need in order to have our endpoints. So the first thing that you need to create is the task class, which is a class that actually contains the model that you would like to save on your database. This class should be an entity decorator, which comes from, as you see, Jakarta. You have all of these things with Spring JPA. And each task entity has an ID, which usually we go for generated value. We want the IDs most of the times in the databases to be generated automatically. It has 2 attributes. One of them is task and the other one is completed, which is a boolean to say if the task is completed or not. Here I use Lombok in order to set all the getters and setters and no constructor for it. And then you need to have also this constructor, which gets tasks and completed and create a task instance for you. This is needed for the JPA. If you don't add this, JPA will give you some error. After creating your model, now it's time to create a repository. So under the repositories folder, you create your task repository. So this repository should be a repository. You should use the decorator repository of Spring Boot. And then you need to extend the JPA repository of type task, and long is the ID of our task. And then you create your methods that you would like your repository to give you. So find by task, find by complete true. These are actually the methods that perform the SQL query to your database and give you whatever you like. For example, I am implementing the find by task to give a specific task and it will return me that task from the database. Why am I do so? Because if you remember, my task has a task and completed, but it also has an ID. I don't know the ID. I want the ID from the database. Or I might want all the tasks that are completed, and so on. So here I'm using this kind of syntax, find by completed true. These are the methods that a Spring JPA let you to do so. So if you write it in a correct way, for example, find by completed false, a Spring JPA automatically creates the SQL query for you that will ask the database to give all the tasks that their completed attribute is false. After creation the repository, now it's time to create the task service. So I have created this class task service. I have to add the service decorator here in order to let the Spring Boot understand that this is a task service, this is the service and it needs to scan it. I auto-wire the task repository. Auto-wire actually let the Spring Boot to automatically inject the dependencies. And I create all the methods that I want. So these are the CRUD methods. Get methods, find methods, create method, and delete method, and so on. So create, update, delete, and get, so CRUD. These are the methods that I would like to have. You can give me the ID that you would like to delete. I get the specific task by that ID, and then I will ask the repository to delete that. So here I'm using the repository 2 times. You can have these kind of methods that you use different methods in your repository in order to get an entity, update it as you prefer, or delete it. So after creating the service, now it's time to create the task controller. The controller is the class that gives you all the endpoints. So I've created the task controller. You should decorate your task controller with the controller decorator in order to let the Spring Boot understand where is your controller. And then I suggest you to put this request mapping, so the base address, the base URL for all of your controllers. So when each controller has its own base address, then it's easier to manage the controllers with Spring Security. Later, you need to insert the task service. So I always use AutoWire. I will let the Spring Boot to manage the dependency injection, and I create all of the methods that I need. So the CRUD methods, create, read, update, and delete methods for my task controller. And as you can see, I'm using my task service to do the stuff, and then I'm returning the response entity for the response. So in the controller methods, you have, for example, get mapping that performs. So this is for a get request, and on the root of this address, I have the get all task. You have post mapping for post request. Again, at the root, I have put it at the root. You can have a put mapping. And here at the root, I'm passing also the ID of the task that I would like to perform some update on it, and the delete mapping, which maps the delete request. And again, here I am passing the ID of the task that I would like to delete. So right now that we have created our task entity, the repository, the task service, and the controller, now it's time to start our application to see if it really works. I have zoomed a bit so you can see the terminal and everything a bit better. Let me start my application, and I got an error. So what is the error? It says unsatisfied dependency injection. It comes from the bin, so Spring Boot cannot create something that I am asking it to create. And what is the issue? It cannot create a data source script database initializer. So there is some issue in the JDBC. So Spring Boot cannot create what it needs to communicate with MySQL database. Let's see what is the issue and how can we solve it. After studying a bit of the dependencies, studying the error, I've understood that I have an issue with the MySQL connector. If you remember, well, the error said it cannot connect to the database, and it didn't find any in-memory database. So here it is. I've put the dependency of MySQL connector, and now if it should work, let's see. Okay, I still have an issue. The issue says failed to configure a data source URL attribute is not specified in the embedded data source. And no embedded data source could be configured. So somehow it cannot read what I am passing to it here. Let's investigate this issue. So sometimes these kind of issues can happen because for some reason the build is not working fine. So the Maven build is not working fine. Especially it happens when you use VS Code. Then you might tell me, why do you use VS Code? Why don't you use IntelliJ? I use VS Code because I write code in different languages, and I use VS Code as a general purpose IDE, if I cannot call it an IDE. In order to test if your application is really working fine or not, I suggest you to run through terminal this command mvn spring boot run and see if it works well. And when I run it like this, it works, and you see that Tomcat is started and it is listening to port 8080. Now let's test if we can call the endpoints. Okay, I've opened Postman. I call the API v1 tasks on localhost 8080. If you remember, this was the endpoint. Do you remember that I said your task controller should have a base address? And I want to perform a get on the root of the controller, and the root of the controller has this base address. So this is why I am calling this API v1 task root. Do you see this backslash? It is the root. And let me call it, and okay, I got all the practices, all the tasks that I have inserted. I've worked with this application before, of course. This is why you see some results here. And I can also delete some of them if I want. For example, I want to delete the one with ID 6. Here I come to delete, endpoint, I call delete on ID 6, it returns me a true, so it seems that it worked fine. Let me call once again, and you don't see the ID 6, so it worked fine. Now let's create one task. So here, let me deactivate the authorization. I will show you how you can perform also authorization with the Spring Security in next videos. Here I have put a body, so let's say practice 1, and I want it to be completed, so it should be true, for example. And now let me create it. Let's see if I can. Okay, I have created it with ID 18. Let's see if this get all is working on it, and yeah, ID 18, so it worked. I can update the ID 18. I want to change the name to my task, and yeah, complete it. Let it be completed, and let me update it. Okay, now the ID 18 is my task instead of practice something, which was before practice 1. Now it is my task, and the status is completed. Let me perform a get all, and yeah, ID 18 right now has my task, and it is completed. So here it is. This is how you can create a to-do list with Spring Boot